Blade Runner is a movie that was released in 1982 and it flopped. However, slowly but surely it acquired a cult following and became one of the most influential science fiction films of all time. And only a mere 35 years later, it has been given a sequel that no one asked for. Is it as good as the original, or is it a sequel that just acts as a detriment to everything the original stood for? We're about to find out. Oh, and just for reference, I will be comparing the final cut of the original Blade Runner in this comparison. So with that said, let the battle commence. Blade Runner takes place in 2019 and follows our main character, Rick Deckard, who is a retired Blade Runner and is tasked with one final job before resuming his retirement. Blade Runners are cops who are assigned to track down and kill replicants. In this world, replicants are androids that have been crafted in a very authentic human form and are created by the Tyrell Corporation. After a deadly uprising, replicants were banned from Earth and were forced to operate on off-world colonies. However, 6 replicants have escaped from their designated colony and returned to Earth with the intention to extend their 4-year lifespan. And it's from this point where the movie starts to become more abstract and open to multiple interpretations, and is one of the many reasons the film has been analysed, admired, and adored, as it provides the relatively simple story with a lot of depth. And the story for Blade Runner 2049 is that our main character, played by Ryan Gosling, is a replicant called K. He has been assigned to take out and kill older replicant models. Along the way, however, he starts to discover more about his past through these sporadic dreams he has, and he starts to question whether they are just dreams or in fact memories. So he decides to investigate what little information he derives from his dreams, and as he goes about his investigation, he soon starts to question his purpose, existence, and even his future once he has fulfilled his usefulness and eliminated the remaining replicants. Now, the pacing for the first movie is definitely an acquired taste and is not for everyone, and it's not that the events that are taking place are boring, it's just that the way in which they are presented is very stiff, and intentionally so. The movie is clearly trying to give off a certain vibe and tone, and in several scenes, it succeeds. However, there are a lot of scenes that play out visually, and they are just way too long. I mean, they look great, but there's only so long you can look at it before it loses the remainder of its visual appeal. In my opinion, if they were condensed, then they would be far more effective, but as is, they have a special talent for making your eyelids get heavy after a while, and the nice visuals and cinematography isn't enough to keep them open. As a matter of fact, if this whole movie was condensed by about 10 to 20 minutes, it would have seriously worked in his favour. Now, the film got a lot better when it came to its final act, but up to that point, it was really starting to become stale and boring. Despite the fact that a lot of interesting stuff was going on, it could have been executed and presented a lot better. For a movie that is under 2 hours, it feels a lot longer, and you really feel every minute go by. As for the second movie, right at the beginning, the tone is set as perfectly as it possibly could for a sequel. Immediately, you feel like you have fallen into the same world. The acting, cinematography, design, and music all felt very loyal to the original movie, while simultaneously receiving some welcome updates. The film also does a great job of showing us what our modern day technology could look like in either an exaggerated world such as this, or just years into the future. Now, the first Blade Runner is renowned for its beautifully designed world and special effects, and 2049 definitely impresses in this department too. There are plenty of sequences that are eerie and wonderfully shot. It intuitively prolongs several scenes and fills them with atmosphere, intrigue, and mystery. The scenes in the first movie really needed to be like this, as the longevity actually provides something of substance rather than just being prolonged for the sake of it. That being said, the second movie isn't entirely devoid of those scenes too. There are many scenes that are padded out so much just so it can brag about its effects and show off. It's really obnoxious after a very short while, and although they are more tolerable to sit through, they are still needlessly long, and it really drags out the movie's runtime, which is significantly longer at approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes as opposed to the first movie's 2 hours. Which movie has the superior story? Well, I much prefer the second movie. The story was full of mystery and intrigue, and it kept me invested, and I genuinely wanted to know what was going to happen in the end. But bear in mind that both films can really wear you down, and that is a flaw they both share. Now, the side characters in both movies serve their purpose fine, so I am only going to focus on our main protagonist for this segment. In the first Blade Runner, our main character is called Rick Deckard, played by Harrison Ford. Now, Deckard is not very enjoyable to watch as a character. The only enjoyable thing about him is the conventional charm that Harrison Ford brings to the role, but that's more down to the actor rather than the character. So what makes Deckard an intriguing character? Well, what I personally find interesting is his change in ideology as the movie progresses. As the movie goes on, you see him go from a man who mercilessly kills these replicants to developing a respect for them as he slowly but surely starts to see them as human beings. And this not only provides him with an arc, but it's what ultimately gives him the motivation to do what he does at the very end of the movie. So I personally find Deckard far more interesting from his developing ethics and characteristics rather than his charisma. Now, contrary to what the trailers want you to believe, Blade Runner 2 is less of Harrison Ford's movie and is more of a Ryan Gosling film. And I have never really been a fan of him before, but he really did carry this movie on his own very well. Surprisingly well. As a matter of fact, when he was on screen, I didn't even once think, come on, when will Harrison Ford show up? Speaking of which, when Harrison Ford did show up, his appearance didn't completely hijack the film and his involvement felt natural. Like, if this was real, it would make perfect sense for him to get dragged into a situation like this. That being said, it's important to note that good old Harrison doesn't show up until the last 30 to 45 minutes of the movie. And honestly, this didn't bother me at all. Why? Well, because as I said, I personally could never get invested into the character of Deckard, and in the sequel, my opinion hasn't changed. Quite surprisingly, I was far more interested and intrigued to follow Ryan Gosling's character. He is just filled to the rim with uncertainty and doubt about himself, and in turn, we are just as clueless about his past as he is. And as he figures stuff out, you figure stuff out with him. And that's what's so great about it. You feel like you are embarking on this journey of self-discovery with him, and that is far more effective and captivating than what you get with Deckard. So as far as our main protagonist goes, Blade Runner 2049 is far superior. The villain for the first Blade Runner is a replicant called Roy. Now, Roy is trying to prevent the crippling nature of the replicants, which is their limited lifespan and the way they are treated. And this is where the irony of his character lies, as despite being a higher class replicant, his goal is basically to survive, which gives him an almost identical nature of sentimentality like humans. Now, I would like to go more in depth to his character, but doing so would go dangerously into spoiler territory, so I will conclude by saying that there is a lot to ponder about with regards to Roy's characteristics, emotions, and intentions. And that's where the genius writing of his villainy lies. And in Blade Runner 2049, our villain is Jared Leto. And as a villain, he sucked. Now, I'm not trashing on Jared Leto's acting ability. I mean, after seeing his terrible performance as Joker, it was actually quite refreshing to see him in a movie where he acts normal, for the most part. But the reason why I think he sucks as a villain is because he doesn't contribute much, and as a matter of fact, he isn't in the movie much. I wouldn't call his role a cameo, but it was damn close. Believe it or not, but he only had 2 scenes in this movie, one of which was in the trailer, and in both of these scenes, he doesn't do anything except talk, and everything he says could have easily been given to another character, and as a result, if you completely took him out of the film, it would be no different. Now, this is a big problem. It felt like the movie didn't have time to give him any more screen presence, and I honestly think this is quite ridiculous because the movie is nearly 3 hours long, and if it used its time more effectively and efficiently rather than spending so much of it lingering on shots, it could have easily given Jared Leto more screen time and something to do rather. Instead, his right-hand henchwoman actually does far more than he does. She practically runs the show. Give all his dialogue to her and we would have had a more effective villain. So as far as the protagonists go, the sequel is superior, but the film with the infinitely better villains is the first movie. Also, I'm sure Roy was supposed to be scary back in the day, but it's kind of silly watching him hoot like an owl and run around in his underpants. As soon as the first movie opens up and you see the futuristic city, I was amazed at how great and authentic it looked, especially when you take into account that this movie was made back in 1982. It wasn't common to see fully realized worlds like this, and what's even more impressive is that this doesn't feel like a fictional world put together for a movie. All the technology and details add up and make it feel real and tangible. What I especially love about the construction of this world is that despite being futuristic, it doesn't look super clean and polished like many movies would have you believe. It actually looks gritty and to a certain extent abused, and I really like and appreciate this different approach. Additionally, the use of colors and cinematography is also very creative and beautiful to look at. And believe it or not, but this movie looks so good that even popular animes such as Ghost in the Shell and Akira took heavy inspiration from it. Heck, even Christopher Nolan said that when designing Gotham City in Batman Begins, he took visual inspirations from Blade Runner. So I cannot emphasize enough how great and inspirational the visuals in this movie are. Even to a new-time viewer in 2017 like myself, this world looks so real, and that is very impressive. That being said, the futuristic design of the city doesn't reflect the look of the insides of the buildings. I mean, they look totally drenched in the 80s, and in turn that really makes them look dated in comparison to the outside world. So in a strange way, visually this film kind of dates itself. Now whereas the first movie looked like a noir anime, the second film looks like a combination of a modern and artistic movie. Everything has gotten the modern CGI update treatment, and I tell ya, it looks amazing. Everything looks grand in scale, and again, it looks like a futuristic city that you can live in. It also managed to incorporate a fair amount of restraint. I mean, I was expecting the movie to go way over the top and integrate the conventional futuristic tech that you would see in every modern big-budget Hollywood production. But on the contrary, it actually stuck to the original movie as a reference for its visuals, and I thoroughly approve of this. The special effects look great, and they really benefit the film from both a visual and storytelling perspective. But which of these two movies visually looks the best? Now I know that 2049 has an unfair advantage due to it having 35 years of technological advancement with its CGI, so that's why I'm going to judge this round on how productively each movie incorporates its effects. And this ultimately comes down to direct correlation with how the visuals help benefit and progress the storytelling. And 2049 is leaps and bounds better than the original movie in this regard. You see, the first movie really lingered on several of its CGI shots, and it made some of the visuals that were originally nice to look at a complete bore very quickly. And the second movie did this too, but to a much lesser degree. It would still do it, but it wasn't anywhere near as obnoxious in its longevity. So the visuals in both movies are fantastic, but in my opinion, the edge goes to Blade Runner 2049 as it incorporated its effects a little more naturally and sparingly. But as an additional compliment to the first movie, what's really impressive about its effects is that they are so ahead of their time that they actually hold up and can be compared to the modern effects in its own sequel 35 years later. They're that good. Now in the first Blade Runner, I wasn't at all fond of the soundtrack. It had great moments, but overall the style of music was just not my type, and if anything, it came off as ineffective and weird to me. Now unbelievably, the second movie completely rectified this. The soundtrack does not only take immense inspiration from the original movie, but it actually added everything I thought the original soundtrack was lacking. It provided an impact, and it also helped make the scenes more intense and even emotional at times. So props to 2049 for being able to fully embrace the original soundtrack and not only make it comparable, but for also making it mandatory and superior. The impressive thing about the action in the original Blade Runner is that it was very realistic and grounded in reality, and to my knowledge that isn't something that was done very often in the 80s, as it primarily consisted of action movies that were overstated and exaggerated. In Blade Runner, however, the chase sequences and shootouts unfold very much in the same vein as they would in real life, and it's this gritty and realistic approach to the action that is very unique, enjoyable, and even admirable. As for Blade Runner 2049, I was expecting that the action would be overblown and exaggerated just as a safe way to impress modern audiences, but I'm glad to say that I was wrong. The action actually stays true to the realistic style of the first movie, and that is both surprising and incredibly admirable that a movie in present time did not give in to the modern audience's perception and incorporate the conventional big-budget action spectacle that is common in pretty much all action movies nowadays. It is actually very modest in the way it presents its action, but at the same time, it does one-up itself significantly from the first movie. In other words, the action remains faithful to the original film whilst giving it the revisions necessary for a modernized update. But in the end, which movie had the better action? Well, as I previously stated, Blade Runner 2049 incorporated everything that made the action so great in the first movie and made it even better. So although the action in both movies is great, I thought it was a lot more entertaining and satisfying in Blade Runner 2049. It had a lot more edge-of-your-seat moments, the length of each fight scene was perfect, and since I cared more for the characters, I was far more invested. So the movie with the superior action is Blade Runner 2049. Now I know what you're thinking, but hear me out. The reason why I repeatedly side with Blade Runner 2049 is because for a sequel that was literally only made to milk money out of the license, it actually has some integrity. It does its best to refrain from using the typical Hollywood tropes. The references and callbacks it has to the first film are done efficiently to benefit the story and not just as a cheap gimmick to play on your nostalgia. For example, some of the story elements that I didn't like in the first Blade Runner are actually continued in 2049, and it doesn't only reference them, but it gives them substance and purpose. In other words, Blade Runner 2049 actually complements the original movie and makes it better. And for a sequel to a beloved classic, that is an unbelievable feat of accomplishment. I mean, can you imagine what the alternative would have been if it disgraced the theories and events of the original movie? But ultimately, the problem with the first Blade Runner is that although I acknowledge that it is a very smart and analytical movie, it's just not the type I can rewatch multiple times. It needs that replay value, and although it clearly has it for many other people, it doesn't have it for me. It's time for the scores. Blade Runner gets a 5 out of 10, and Blade Runner 2049 gets a 7. Apologies for the lack of videos recently guys, but rest assured I have plenty more on the way. My next Versus video will be Justice League versus the Avengers, and after that I will do the original Ghostbusters versus the female Ghostbusters. I will also give you my thoughts on every single episode of Stranger Things Season 2 in a new series I am planning to create. You will definitely want to stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for your patience and for your continuous support guys. I really hope you enjoyed another one of my Versus videos. Also, be sure to follow me on my social networks. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thanks again for watching guys, and I will catch all of you next time. Take care.